Try to imagine all life as you know it stopping instantaneously and every molecule in your body exploding at the speed of light.
Total Protonic Reversal.
Protonic Reversal.
Protonic Reversal with your host, Conan Neutron. Broadcasting from a secret underground lair in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
A gigantic middle finger to everything that is rotten about music, rock and roll, and corporate power.
The thing is, though, if you don't laugh, you're going to go on a killing spree with sharpened nails.
Confidence of a hero or a fool. I wasn't exactly certain which.
Could not be more professional.
It's only one I choose to devote my life to. That's okay.
It means something. It means something.
And take that away.
You know, that's my take on it. What's yours?
Protonic Reversal!
That's like a science thing, right?
Indeed it is. It is a science thing. It is a science place. It is a scientific fact. We are all up in your face. It is time for the one, the only Protonic Reversal, and we welcome you to it. Tonight is going to be an awesome show. They're all awesome shows. Mr. Mike Morasky, Steelpolebathtub, Milk Cult, etc., etc. Awesome dude, one of my favorite guitar players of all time. And we're going to talk some deep geek about some awesome old noise rock and other things as well. Okay, so housekeeping. Thanks everybody for the feedback on the recent shows, especially the Jerry Casale episode, which has definitely gotten a lot of heat outside of the normal parties. Of course, we're still doing these for stay-at-home editions. These are all shows that are designed to keep you at home, which is where you should be during this pandemic. If you are wondering where a certain episode of the show is, because it's not on the free feed yet, we're going to get there. If you do want them immediately, patreon.com/Protonic Reversal. $1 a month gets you all the shows immediately in their unedited, not that there's ever really that much editing, very raw form. So make of that what you will. If it's something that's that important to you, $1 a month will get you there. I haven't even worked out what it is per episode at this point. It's probably like 10 cents per episode or something at this point with the amount that we're cranking out. Anyway, that's that. Thanks to everyone who's sharing the show along, letting people know that this is a thing that's worth paying attention to. There's been a great groundswell of support, and just want to say thank you. That's really nice. It's nice. Okay, so we're going to play a song. We'll come back with Mr. Mike Morasky. I am stoked. Let's listen to... Well, we're going to listen to the hit, Train to Miami.
Myself
You were hired by a bitch to find scum. No, that's another song. That was, of course, Train to Miami by Steelpolebathtub. And right now we are talking to the one and only Mr. Mike Morasky.
Hey,
Mike,
Conan.
welcome to the show, dude.
Hey, thanks.
It's been a bit.
Glad to be here.
It's been a bit.
It has been a while. It feels like yesterday, kind of, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how time works that way. So I started off with Steelpolebathtub. Of course, I characterize it as the hit as much as I suppose you guys would have hits. And the reason why I mention that is because of course that's one of the songs that's in the video game. It's in Left 4 Dead, and it's something that I guess when you guys were making Train to Miami, did you ever have any idea that it would kind of resonate with people beyond just like being another crazy song on one of your better records? No. I mean, of course not. Do you, like, when you write stuff, do you ever sort of have that vision? Like I just listened to your interview with Dale. Oh yeah. And what do you say? Like, we're accidentalists. That was such a that's very
what a great
true,
quote.
Yeah. Right.
But afterwards, once you kind of get done and you start putting the record together, I guess you start to see that it's going. I mean, obviously, once it was out on the radio and whatnot, like there was this brief window in time where, Extra Width was big, right? It had just come out, and Rid of Me was out. And we were right in that mix, and I so felt like we were adults for just a split second, know.
Like nuance was allowed for once.
Yeah, well, it was like our record was being played alongside these records that we just were like, infatuated with, and so for a split second there, it kind of felt like we were playing with the big boys, They allowed
the weirdos in for. Totally. For a few minutes. Well, and that's something where it's almost like they hadn't figured out the new formula at that point. Like they were like, okay, well, let's roll with this, I guess. We can still make money on this, boys. Don't worry about it.
Right. I mean, because Nirvana was just like really hitting, right? And and so the clubs, like we went from the 300 capacity to 500 to suddenly you were looking at 1,000, and so everything was ramping up, but nobody knew what it was that actually worked, when really it was pretty easy to look and go, well, Nirvana is kind of like the Beatles of underground,
there's not that much difference to it. It's louder and more aggressive sounding, but like ultimately they're pop songs like played with punk rock passion.
Right, and so there's just this wave that all the rest of us detritus were sort of getting swept along with. But I mean, to be totally fair, like,
wow,
there was like, I think there were some pretty discerning listeners at the time, and shit was kind of opening up too, like we would tour, we brought Ethel Meat Plow with us on a tour, and and that was like that. It's definitely pushing some boundaries in some Midwestern towns, and people were down. So
Ethel Meat Plow, who I actually did find out by them through you guys, and they were such a puzzling band. Like I just didn't understand, in a very real way, I didn't understand what they were all about at first, which I think was awesome, because that's coming from that time period where that's an asset, not a liability. Like, oh, I can't wait to figure this out, rather than, oh, I don't understand this.
Right. Yeah. Well, I also listened to your since I knew this was coming up, I walk my dog every day for an hour and a half or something. So I listened to a bunch of your episodes, and I was listening to, it's really enjoyable stuff. And I listened to the one with Steve McDonald, and he was talking about, sort of that identification with music, and you guys also mentioned SST, which was really funny. But I was thinking of SST as being like this label that kind of were the first ones to branch. It was like,
right, yeah,
it was hardcore, but then it was like the Minutemen and Sonic Youth and Butthole Surfers and and fucking Dinosaur Jr., right? Like it was super all over the place. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure all those bands were on SST.
Well, yeah, and it was hardcore as determined by like an ethos and mindset rather than like a strict set of musical guidelines and rules.
Right, exactly. And so we were always sort of like of that mindset. So bringing, Ethel Meatplow with us made perfect sense to us, right? Even though they were weird kind of club fuck dance music thing from LA,
right, for sure.
And we definitely like to piss our audience off a little bit when possible, I think.
Challenge them a little bit, maybe to go outside their comfort zone, perhaps.
Challenge them for sure.
That's the nice way to put that.
Right. But, so there was that weird era. It's funny though, like when I think about some of those, we definitely danced all like through all these different scenes. Mm-hmm. We were always like just in a scene enough to be kind of owned by the scene, but not enough to be really big in that scene. Right. You know what I mean? Like the Gilman Street thing, Pat from 1, 2, 3, 4 Go a couple of years. What was it? Probably forever ago now. Like time just is blurring into this a mass of shit that just goes by.
Right.
But there was some anniversary show at Gilman, and he wrote to me and was like, "Hey, you guys got to reform for this anniversary. Like we always thought of you as a Gilman band, and we played a ton of shows at Gilman and have a lot of friends in that scene." Mm-hmm. But again, it's like, yeah, but Op Ivy was the Gilman band or Green Day, right? Like those are the real successful, or Neurosis. And I mean, I still do identify with it, but then, anyway, so the thing is it's sort of like, when we were touring, we'd play some, show with like Verbal Assault or whatever.
Sure,
and, and everybody's like, oh yeah, these guys are punk. But then it's like, well, we don't quite play the straight, 2/4 backbeat, kind of thing. And
there's also a song called Arizona Garbage Truck that literally sounds like an Arizona garbage truck.
Right. So I don't know how many shows like we'd show up at and everybody'd be like, oh, you guys are a grunge band. And then they go like, well, no, but if you're a grunge band, you're kind of a shitty grunge band. Or like a punk scene would be like, oh yeah, you guys are a punk band. It's like, oh, not really a great punk band actually, and even the noise scene, it's just like, they're too rock or whatever. So
yeah, it's almost like you guys were too freaky bizarre for anyone like into like the poppy side of it, and then too heavy and weird for people that were more like conventional indie rockers. Wasn't exactly punk, wasn't exactly metal. There wasn't enough flannel for the grungers, It kind of seemed like of the Venn diagrams, there was like a very small like overlap that was, like-minded folks such as yourself. And it always seemed to me, and again, maybe that's coming from my personal experience of being in the Bay Area at the time, and just everything being, kind of like the montage shot in the movie where the kid comes from the podunk town. Oh my God, what's this? What's that? But it seemed like there was common cause with bands like Melvins that also were, as it turns out, rather iconoclastic, but basically following their own thing and their own worldview and making their own world rather than easily sliding into something that already existed.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, as in so much as like, I can associate ourselves with the Melvins in any way, shape or form. But, we definitely like, I thought it was really cool that given their, I mean, see now it's so hard to not mess up the current, the current blur of reality with the past blur, because it's like, well, the Melvins, like they influenced Nirvana, and shouldn't they have been on, Sub Pop or whatever, instead of, Boner Records. But back then it was like the Melvins were a small band, right? Everyone was a small, there just was no such thing as a big, I mean, to me, I saw the Melvins, we lived in Seattle for a period there before moving down here. And before, we became label mates, but I saw them opening for Oh my God! Now obviously, see, my old brain is totally getting in the way.
Rick Valentin always goes and Rose too. They both do the old people thing whenever you can't remember something.
Come on, Michael Gerald and
Killdozer.
Fuck! Thank you so much. And it was just like, and so I was like, oh, the Melvins are huge. They opened for Killdozer, but it was at this like club that held like 200 people, and there were 75 people. Right.
You
know what I mean?
Yeah, and they were big bands in your mind, but when it comes time to, if you think about like, larger impact on the music world at large, it wasn't. It was like underground big, and that's also something where, just to digress a little bit, I think the kids today, a lot of them, I'll run into bands that are younger bands that are like awesome as hell, but to them, like a band like Carp was just as big as like Smashing Pumpkins, and I'd be like, I can assure you that was not the case.
Right. Exactly.
I guarantee you that's just not true.
Yeah. I forget. Sorry, I totally digress. I have no idea what we were talking about.
I mean, hey, you've heard this show. That's like, it's half half the show is digressions. It'd be like 3 minutes and that freaking shellac song if there wasn't any digressions.
Right. Oh, well, I guess yeah. I usually can find my way back if I like give myself a second.
But I mean, that scene and talking about like, the Boner Records and like, Kilowatt and that era of San Francisco, and you guys are sliding into that while at the same time being not necessarily of any specific musical genre, quote unquote, scene as a, I guess would now buy it Hot Topic.
And I think, I guess the thing too, the iconoclastic thing, and I think the Melvins were definitely a little more cynical than we ever were, but we were very cynical. And I remember at one point, we both kind of had this anti-Sub Pop thing, and it wasn't so much like Sub Pop was great. Like I had friends on Sub Pop, like they had great bands and they were smart about packaging and all that shit that I really actually can really appreciate. But everywhere you went, everybody'd be like, are you a Sub Pop band? Are you, have you heard, Blood Circus or what, I guess, whatever the band was that, that was hot from Sub Pop at the moment. And so I remember at one point going up and playing.
Cat Butt, maybe? No.
Cat Butt. Oh, I love Cat Butt, though.
It's been about 30 episodes since I did a Cat Butt reference, so I had to throw it in.
Oh, man. I just, those guys are rad. And, and they were real good friends with L7, who we were friendly with. And they're just, I don't know, they were fun. They were a fun, kooky band. And so they totally jived with our mentality. But, so I remember going up and playing at the Vogue, I think. And I think it was one of the shows with, no, I can't remember. Anyway, it was a Vogue show. And we were talking to, Jonathan Poneman, like he was going to do a 7-inch for, steelpolebathtub on Sub Pop. And it was going to be our big breakthrough or whatever. And of course we get on stage and start making fun of Kiss and how all the bands in Seattle are into Kiss and, and just
how to win friends and influence people. The Steelpolebathtub story.
Just like completely, just completely fucking it up, but that was just how we were, we just were like, well, okay, I guess this isn't our scene, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and that's also something where I think that is from the outside, it kind of seemed like that was the ethos. Like when I first heard Steelpolebathtub, it was on like a mixtape that a friend of mine had made that had the vast majority of Tulip and Miracle and like part of Butterfly Love, but wasn't really clearly labeled what was what. So I just listened to the whole thing as if it was one gigantic composition, and it was something where when I first started listening to it, I was like, wow, this is bizarre. Like, this is like kind of like, it's cool, but it's all over the place. And of course, the thing that jumped out the most was the samples. And, we'll get into that in depth later. We don't have to talk about it right this second. But it even though there are bands that, some of your guitar stuff, of course, I was like, oh, this is like a more like, unhinged Dead Kennedys, like East Bay Rig, like guitar. This is like really interesting. And especially all the surfy stuff, right? And then also thinking that, these other bands like Sonic Youth and Melvins and stuff that I already loved. It's like, oh, it's like this, but it's like a crazed, like psychedelic film noir version of it. Like, I just had a hard time like figuring it out, and I enjoyed the ride of trying to figure it out. And then as I kind of got there, I realized like, oh no, they're purposefully doing this. Like, they can write something more conventional and be more conventional, but this is like what their compass is. They're trying to carve out this, you know, rather than like just take the freeway, they're building a road to wherever it is that they're going.
Right. Yeah. And like, it's sort of that laying the track as the train goes concept.
Right. Exactly. Like in the cartoon.
Yeah. Except for there's three of us, you know,
Yeah.
and just all three of us were completely, and we still are complete art nuts, you know, just, you know, off in our own bizarre universes. And you know, we happen to still are good friends. And I think, on similar pages, just in that regard, even though as individuals we're extremely different and our exact specific interests are super different.
Right.
But that aspect of it, the deep interest and love of art and of trying to do something deep and different and interesting and not too precious, hopefully, you know, is all, you know, that's definitely uniform throughout it.
Well, there's a lot of things I would use to describe Steelpolebathtub, and precious is definitely not one of them. It's not not precious music in any way, shape, or form. But you know, in a good way. Like, it's something where, like, and again, we kind of started off this line of thought with introducing the mindset and events happening around that time, that there was that kind of brief moment where just genuine freaks, nerds, and weirdos could get a hearing. And it wasn't necessarily like, oh, you're going to be the next Nirvana, but of course that's what the executives wanted. But it was this confluence of things where weird stuff could get out of its subgenre of a subgenre, click of a click that it otherwise would have been in before.
Right. Yeah. And it was weird to be part of that and to experience it. And I mean, admittedly, there were shows, you know, that we played where, you know, like 1,000 people in Atlanta, and they're all fucking there and they love us. Like, and they know our music and they know the songs, and it's like, wow, how did this happen? This is really cool.
Right. Yeah. Wow. This must be like what it feels like to be in a successful band. Neat.
Right. You know, outside of San Francisco.
Right. Yeah. You
know, because you hang out in the city, or at least in the old days, you just play enough scenes and get them all coming to your show, and you've got 1,000 people. Right. But at the same time, then we like probably around that same time played. I remember playing Dallas, and it was before Emo had one of his clubs. What was it? Forget, it was different, like the Orbit Room, I think it was called. But it was some other club in the Pearl District, right? That funny neighborhood.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
The
I think so,
hipster neighborhood in Dallas. And you know, I remember playing, and there's like straight up Texas style, you know, women super dolled up with mini skirts dancing by the side of the stage. Like, right. It was like, wait, do you actually hear what we're doing?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, this is not what I would think of when you said the word dance music.
Or did some hype machine get you here and just like you believe this is where you're supposed to be? And, you know, eventually you learn that that's actually true. Like, for a lot of how that shit works is someone tells people where they should be, and that's where they go, and they're perfectly happy consuming it, you know, and which is okay too, but it's harder to imagine often with really harsh, weird music, you know?
Yeah, and reconciling that with the fact that you're making this artistic statement, like you're doing art, and then it's like, oh yeah, these people are just here to, you know, have a Saturday.
Yeah, the civilians.
Yeah, you know? Exactly. The gen pop.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, I still struggle with that a little bit. Like, Steve, it hasn't
changed that much, really.
Yeah, McDonald's, he said he's kind of struggling with that personal identity thing. And I have a broad, super broad space that I work in, and I'm really interested in all forms of art and music at this point, except, the day that I actually appreciate the Grateful Dead, you should come put a fucking bullet in my head.
That's the Invasion of the Body Snatchers moment. That's how you know that
Yeah.
He's a
There's
double.
something about that music just makes me feel bad acid in my body, and that's not a good musical form in my opinion. But
Not a desirous effect nor a desirous sound.
no. I mean, I know a ton of people who love them, so I'm probably wrong in some aspect. But,
I mean, hey man, I worked at a record store in Berkeley, so you can imagine, just having like all the all the central castings, hippie, post-hippie hippies wandering up and wanting to talk about the dead. It's like, oh Christ, shoot me. And meanwhile, I'm sitting here in my like Ramon shirt, listening to The Birthday Party at deafening volumes. I'm like, So what leads you to believe that I want to talk about this? But
right, yeah. Well, I live in Berkeley now, so I can kind of relate. Although that generation's getting super old. So it's more like a geriatric
Geriatric Garcia.
Yeah. Oh, that's pretty good.
Thank you.
That's a band name right there.
Yeah, for real. So then talk to me about, because you did, and you mentioned in one of the things we talked about that relocating, because you come from Montana, and then you spent time. There was like Denver, there was Seattle before Bay Area. Like there was like the steelpolebathtub prehistory, if you will.
Yeah. Growing up, I didn't fully grow up in Montana, to be 100% honest. I think I moved there when I was 9 or 10.
Charlatan, get off my screen.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, you've got some kind of chat thing going, don't you? Like you're like.
Yes.
Like on the side.
Yeah.
That's so modern of you.
I know. I'm like a multitasking marvel.
Right. I forget what I was going to say. Oh, Montana. But yeah, I don't know. It, like in some ways, David Lynch is from Montana, right? And so, I left home when I was pretty young, 15 going on 16, and kind of got exposed to a lot of, it was the 70s. So like I'm basically, you ever seen that movie Dazed and Confused?
Yes.
Right?
Oh yeah, the esoteric art film Dazed and Confused. I believe I've seen it. Yeah.
Right. I'm the kid. Like
gotcha.
Kid,
gotcha. Okay.
Except for instead of football jocks, like the older kids that were like the football dudes, like they were my enemies, and it was just all weirdo stoner pre-action sports, extreme skiing, types, right? So, the guys who we'd spend our day going and jumping off 80-foot cliffs into, reservoirs and whatnot. And just kind of a real outside of the mains, Montana, speaking of no internet, like there was no cable television practically, right? Like no MTV, and so everything was automatically 20 years in the past. And so, it really kind of informed my early dark views of humanity,
Right.
Some of the things I was exposed to. At the same time, it was super fun, and I got to, I had a pretty wild teenagehood and played in a lot of bands, and it was a small town. Bozeman at the time, I think, was 10 or 11,000 people, and in fact, a guy just did a documentary on the music scene in Montana from that era, the late 70s, early 80s kind of punk thing. And, he covers Jeff Ament from Big Sandy, in Pearl Jam, and Albini a little bit, right? Like he's from Montana.
Yep, before he moved to Chicago. That's right.
Exactly, right. And then there was this band called the Pugs who were like Devo from Billings, and they were hugely influential in Bozeman because they came to college there. They were 2 or 3 years older, and one of those guys went on to become a famous film director. I forget what he did, like Red Rock West, and some of those kind of noir films from the late 80s, early 90s that were pretty cool, actually. But anyway, so, when I look back, it's like, it was a pretty rad scene, actually. It's just when you're a teenager, you kind of hate everything and you need to move on. And I wanted to get to the big city and experience. Anyway, so, I don't know. I think there's a lot to be said for coming from a small town, because there's nowhere to go but up and out,
Yeah, you have to you don't have a choice. You have to devise your own form of entertainment in a lot of cases. And part of that helps you decide what's important to you and what you are looking for from the world.
Right, because it also says what you're not at the same time.
Totally.
Right?
Like you can be like, yeah, these, redneck homophobic idiots over here, I'm not that. That is a thing that I am not.
Right. 100%, and especially back then, the 70s and early 80s, like there was even, Democrats, quote unquote, as if that's a liberal definition, but were very everyone was fucking patriarchal, religious, very controlling. Those boomers, it's the fucking boomers, they just cannot they still can't let us have
it. They won't do it. They won't do it. They just won't.
And that's what, I technically, okay, this is a beef of mine. Technically, I was born in 1964, so that means I'm technically a boomer, right? But I don't understand how that fucking works because my parents are actual boomers, right?
Right, because they're at the top end and you're at like the dividing line,
right? And so how do a parent and child not define different generations? Like that's just absurd. That doesn't
make any sense.
No, and my generation, the slacker Gen X thing was a direct reaction to that patriarchal elbow on the back of your neck thing where it was like, okay, you're not going to let us have it. So we're going to go do something else. We're going to slack. We don't care about what you care about. We're not going to be consumers. We're not going to be ambitious money people. You know what I mean? Yeah. And we're going to live quote unquote alternative lifestyles. Right. So anyway, that's a little bit of my beef, especially about, that era and rural America and whatnot.
Well, anyway, those generational things are so ridiculous anyway. I mean, it's something where I'm technically Generation X, but like it's like I'm an in-betweener. And the best thing I heard from it was that I'm part of the Oregon Trail generation, which I thought was amazing. But it's unfortunately only something I saw once in an article and nobody ever said it again. But
I like that though. Yeah.
I like that because it tells you everything you need to know. Like I played Oregon Trail in school at lunch, and like that tells you what you need to know. But it's like I'm definitely not real. I'm not a millennial, really. But it's like I kind of feel like mostly left out of the Gen X conversation. Also, I'm just sort of in this in between thing. So I mean, it's also arbitrary.
Yeah, because I assume. Wait, you're like what year were you born?
70s, like late 77, December 77.
Right. So you're a solid 10 to 15 years younger than I am. Right. So, yeah, you're a totally different generation as far as that goes, even though we share at this point, you get old enough, everybody's the same age.
Right. Well, and especially when you come from punk rock, I think there's a certain amount of things that transcend other cultural touchdowns. Right.
Well, and that's sort of the thing that at the end of the day, like that, even though labels, like you can't really define yourself with labels. They're really helpful to like say, well, actually, these are my people. Like this is, these I can relate to these people, and everyone else. That's like I said, everyone else are civilians. And once you go into the civilian population, you got to figure each person out individually, and that's a lot of work. Yeah.
I'm exhausted just hearing you talk about it. It's terrible.
Right.
So you're living in Montana. You have your sort of cultural shorthand. You're defining yourself by what you aren't.
Right. And so I went to Japan for a couple of years. Well, actually, we moved to Seattle. Dale and I had a band with a couple other people, dear old friends of mine, and we were huge in Bozeman. Played some of the other cities in Montana. We were playing 4 nights a week, 4 hours a night, 5 nights a week, kind of thing. You bring your own PA. Right. 70% covers, you sneak your originals in there, but we were kind of a new wave punk band, quote unquote, that brought out the college kids. So the country bars would put up with us, and we were pro. Like I listened back to that stuff, and we could play and be in tune and all that stuff. And so
meet all the baseline criteria of being a band, which is nice.
Yeah. Like our volume levels were reasonable, and
right.
And people came out and danced, and that's all the bar cares about, because then they're going to drink. And And so we thought we'd go to Seattle and make it big. And, of course, went to Seattle and got our, hat handed to us, pretty fucking quickly. But it was, it was an adventure. We played a bunch of shows, so this was 82, 83 maybe. And then finally that fell apart and we broke up, and I moved to Japan because, long story, but my dad was on sabbatical there. And so, but I just went and, ended up in Tokyo for a couple of years and did my own weird art, music thing there for a while. And then I came back and kind of rehooked up with Dale, and we moved to Colorado together on this hilarious gig doing what turned out to be sort of this experimental new age music project, but we just got paid. So that's, all that mattered. We drank a lot of coffee and
sure. Yeah. When you're of a certain age, it's sort of like the details matter a little less than like, hey, check it out. Look at this thing we're doing.
Yeah,
cool.
We're like 19 or 20 and just like, I don't know, someone's paying us and we don't really have to do much. So this is awesome.
Were you playing with Darren at this point? Or
no,
okay.
It was before that. We were in Boulder, and we were hanging out with this. There was a friend of ours, Nate Howe, or Nate 9000, was living with us in Colorado, and he's just a friend, skier, musician. And we were we were kind of hanging out with acoustic instruments mostly, getting really into, the idea of playing on the street, not hippie style, punk style still, right? But,
right. Coming at it from a different place, but, maybe utilizing the same tools, but not coming at it from the we'll call it the Grateful Dead mindset. How about that?
Yeah, right. It was definitely very punk. And then we sort of in that process, we became, at one point we decided we were going to okay, we should make a band. And we had this thing where we had a newspaper subscription, and we would go through and just pull the newspaper apart and just never throw it away. And it was just like all over the floor. So the house was slowly filling up with crumpled, cut up newspaper. And, it was just everywhere. And we were cutting words out and taping them all over the walls. And so eventually we were like, oh, I think the original was steelpolebathtub, sour boot, voodoo milk cult. Which
right. Yeah. It really flows off the tongue.
Right. And so, of course, this is my memory, which I have a weird, fucked up brain that remembers things in kind of blurry concepts. So, Dale, you'll have to have Dale on, and he can correct all of this for you.
We've been talking about it for a while. It'll happen. I don't know what his excuse is now. Like, there's not like he's got something else better to do. So,
well, he has a great memory. So, that's the thing. Like, he can actually remember the reality of it, like the quote unquote proper way of remembering things.
Yeah. Actual reality versus perceived reality. But I mean, I think there's a certain degree of rational effect every time you talk to different people from a group, and that's okay.
Yeah, good, because that's about all I got. But anyway, so true to form, like, because we were both very into the New York factory scene and the sort of this idea of marketing as art form and whatnot, and so Dale started putting up posters before we were even performing.
Oh, that's right. And Jesus, I knew about this and I forgot about it. So I'm glad we're talking about it.
And it was such a great thing. We did that in San Francisco too when we moved here. Just putting up these really cool looking posters, but with no date on it.
Yeah,
and
and here's the reason why I remember it. I did the same thing. It's one of the many things I ripped off from you. Like, before Replicator was a thing, we did the same thing. It just these mysterious looking, like, oh wow, what is that? Like, and I was like, oh yeah, I wholesale ripped that off from Steelpolebathtub too. So there you go.
Yeah, and it's really easy because then you don't have to go actually get a gig. And by the time you are getting a gig, people have heard of you and think that you're important somehow, right?
You're the guys with those bizarre flyers. They're so mysterious looking. Yeah.
Right.
Especially with it's I assume that the artwork back then had the same sort of iconic visual look that later defined what Steelpolebathtub and Milk Cult were doing.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, Dale's had been doing that sort of cut up Xerox, his version of that concept for for a while. And
Ransom Note Chic / William Burroughs /
Yep. Exactly. With his awesome genius twist, there's this flavor to everything he does that is just so great. But which, is fucking key to, having a successful band, is just having good artwork, especially if you're a weird art band like we were. So we were doing that. And, during that period, we hooked up with this band. We became really good friends with these guys, Bloodflower. And Bloodflower was comprised of, amongst other people, Dave Eugene Edwards, who later became 16 Horsepower, and Woven Hand.
Oh, sure. Of course, yeah.
Killer. And then also Slim Cessna, Mark Cessna. And they were just this great, kind of goth, I guess that era was at mid-'80s. So very kind of down-tempo, moody, a lot of echoey guitar and multiple vocals. They were just such a great band. And so we kind of started hanging out with them and, got even, we started ratting our hair up more and our sort of street twang became a little darker and moodier. And eventually we started getting electric instruments. And I mean, around that time we saw, we listened to everything, right? So, but I think we were probably listening to a lot of Gun Club, as I recall. Yeah. And it slowly started morphing into more of, the post Bauhaus kind of thing because we were hanging out with those guys. And so we started getting instruments, and Nate was playing he was playing, I think, a snare and a tom, just like a Psycho Candy. I can never fucking remember
Jesus
the name
and Mary
of that.
Chain.
Every time. There is not a single time I try and remember Jesus and Mary Chain that I don't have to go to Psycho Candy first. And then
right.
I don't know what it is,
You set like a maze with a thread that you can follow in your mind.
I can always get there, but it just takes me a second. But yeah, so he was kind of doing it, because he wasn't quote unquote a real drummer, but and during that period was awesome. We played, I think our first show ever, we would go back to Bozeman because we were in Denver, and we would drive up to Bozeman to open shows for Joe Howard's shows up in Bozeman. And so our first show was opening for the Meat Puppets. And and then we played with the Mercy Seat and eventually later, so fast forward a little bit, eventually we got a quote unquote real drummer, and we were getting louder and noisier and, having amps and guitar, becoming a rock band again, because we had done that obviously before when we were younger. And eventually we kind of realized we needed, our drummer went off to be a pilot, I think. His dad was like, okay, enough of this rock shit. You better go get your...
You better go fly and start flying stuff around.
Yeah, become a real adult and make real money or whatever.
Enough with this fooling around business.
Yeah, it was really, and I think his dad had been in the Marines or something. So it was definitely one of those aye, Captain, okay. And he wasn't really, in it. He wasn't a lifer anyway. So that's when we moved to Seattle because I think Darren, which by the way is now Dorothy, just
Dorothy,
to be clear.
Exactly. Which
Dorothy,
not Dorothy Morex, but yeah, just Darren is Dorothy now, and we should make sure not to dead name Dorothy.
No, it's I think it's Dorothy.
If it's an alias, can you really be a dead? Well, I don't know. That's a separate question.
And I try to I think it's all groovy, but I have two very woke teenagers, girls, and so I know that, as a old white dude, I am not really entitled to any sort of opinion or anything. But when it comes to telling stories, in the past, I have a really hard time applying Dorothy to Darren.
Right.
It's just it's two different, and they're still the same person. But for me, it's a harder thing for, it's like saying they. It takes a lot of practice to do, you know,
to rewire your brain to
right.
Yeah. To do the right thing there. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, so we moved to Seattle to adopt Darren into the band and live there for, God, I want to say a couple of years, but it was probably only a year or something.
And this is after Mr. Ep and the calculations, right?
Yes, right. And I think he had been living somewhere overseas or elsewhere or something and had just come back and was available. And Dale was friends with him at the time and was sort of like, this guy's great. We got to go get this drummer. And so I was like, okay, let's go. Seattle sounds great. And, you know, during that, okay, so this is the funny part. So anyway, and as that happened, the music we were listening to continued to morph, you know, and get darker and heavier. A lot of Henry Rollins started coming into the picture. Big Black was sort of, Big Black came along a lot earlier, but and I was exposed to it because of the Montana thing, but it just became much more part of our diet, and Darren was part of infusing that in SST. So anyway, so we're slowly but surely getting noisier, and we had another guitar player at the time who was not interested in going that direction, and so Paul Rose, he ended up exiting the band at that point. And pretty much that's, basically 85, 86, somewhere in there is when it solidified into what became Steelpolebathtub that everybody knows.
That's when you had that first cassette demo, like around that time period, like before the We Own Drills, but the earlier one.
The We Own Drills tape is the first one with the 3-piece, like the three of us.
Okay.
And then the one before it, the house tape, it's sort of the folk art house cabin.
Yeah, I have a copy of it somewhere. If somebody put a gun to my head and said you need to produce this right now, I'd be a dead man because I couldn't find it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. There's some charm. There's definitely some charm to it. You can really hear what we were into. We were living at a house outside Denver, a little town called Littleton, and there was like a scene of, remember that era when if teenagers like got in trouble with their parents, they'd put them away in loony bins, like the teenager loony bin.
Yeah.
That was happening in this nearby town to Littleton, and so all those kids would escape from the loony bin and then come hang out with us.
Some might say out of the frying pan into the fire.
Yeah, maybe a little bit there. But we were all dirt poor, and we'd go buy potatoes and give them we'd all eat potatoes together or whatever, just so that they didn't starve. And
potatoes are nice and cheap. They get a little nutrition.
The loaf of bread for the treat,
Yeah, exactly. That's a treat.
Yeah. So anyway, you can hear that's what that era was. So there was Paul Rose. You can hear him on there. In fact, there's one of the, I forget what the song is called, but it's like really beautiful, and you can kind of tell we were in a different. That was the space we were in was sort of a bit of a different mindset, but you can sort of hear where we're going at the same time. Yeah. But we had met this band. We would play, so we would still continue going. So then from Seattle to Bozeman and playing shows, and we went out and opened for Sonic Youth, I think, is one of our first shows as that 3-piece. And they were just super into us. So we then followed them to Denver. And since, we had lived there, we knew a bunch of people, and we started playing shows there, and just stuck around in Denver for a while playing shows, with the Warlock Pinchers, it's sort of where that whole, how we know all those bands like BumCon and whatnot. Right. And anyway, so the Rhythm Pigs came through, and I don't know if you remember the Rhythm Pigs.
Wow. Not heard about the Rhythm Pigs in quite some time. No.
Right. Like kind of country punk.
Yeah.
And they had this whole thing where they would go on tour, quote unquote, and they would basically move to a town and then make girlfriends and stay there on people's couches playing shows until the town would sort of kick them out. And then
like a Wild West medicine show, or
Totally.
or a grifter in the 20s or something along those lines. Just wait until you wear out your welcome and then move on to the next town.
Run out of town while they're shooting at you.
Right.
That sort of thing. And so we thought we would try and do that. And we kind of booked some shows and tried to pull that off. But Denver was really the only place in Bozeman that we could actually do it, because we knew enough people that we could, hop around. And I guess we weren't enough of ladies' men to really have places to stay or whatever. And so I had a really dear old friend in San Francisco. And so we kind of came out here. And they had a warehouse in East Oakland, and we played a couple shows and just were immediately like, we got to come back here. Yeah. And so, in those shows, I think those first couple of shows were like, Christ on Parade and Op Ivy, and, and the scene was banging, as they say, know? And so and then we moved back to Seattle, get our shit together, and then kind of move down to San Francisco. And that's sort of the beginning of, the
steelpolebathtub as the world knows it. So, and it's, there are elements on that EP, the We Own Drills. Like there's elements of what you guys would do there. It definitely sounds like, a Baby Pictures version of steelpolebathtub. But of course, Butterfly Love is really when it's kind of like, that seems like the first statement of intent recording for what you guys were doing.
That sounds about right. Yeah. I mean, the whole package, right? The art and the kind of appropriationalism and the noise and the writing. It's so funny. I still struggle with the writing a little bit, but I'm super into the paradigm. Like, I'm not so much into like, we didn't have internet or phones, or because you can't explain that to the kids. And honestly, they don't give a shit. They're like,
and you know what? They shouldn't. It doesn't matter.
No, it's like, whatever, loser.
Like, that sounds dumb. Anyway, moving on.
Right. Exactly.
It's like, well, you can't imagine how much dumb stuff we had to do.
But you can. But the paradigm of the time, I think, is really interesting, and you think about, so quarantine. I'm so glad we didn't start this with quarantine, but
same here, because I feel like I've been doing that a lot, because the first thing you ask is like, how are you doing? And it's like, well, yeah, I'm in quarantine. Oh yeah, me too. And literally everyone else.
I mean, yeah. I'm not suffocating in a tent with none of my family around. Thank you.
There's other people doing far worse. We have Netflix. It's therefore way easier than it was being on tour anytime in the past, couple decades before this.
Exactly. I mean, I'm definitely old enough. I'm very paranoid about getting the virus, but still. So you'll relate to this. It made me think of you a little bit. Is my wife and I, mostly my wife, but I do it from time to time, do this thing where we've contributed a bunch of money, and there's this organization that buys like 50 meals twice a day from 2 restaurants. So they're cycling through local restaurants, sure, and then delivering them to healthcare workers on the front lines. Right?
Awesome. That's so killer. Yeah,
it's
good.
And so all we do is we're the driver, right? And we've got it down like to where you call, you arrange it, you pull up, you pop the hatch in the back, so because I really, really, really don't want to get this thing, like I could easily be one of those people that's like, oh, well, he was alive last week.
Yeah, totally, because it happens very quickly that way.
Yeah. So like I'm no hero, but anyway, so last night I drove to this little restaurant that's down like at 12th and Webster, downtown Oakland. And then was driving to Summit, which is just right. You just go right through downtown Oakland to go to Summit. And, holy shit, like everything was boarded up.
Oh, dude, it looks like 28 days later or something, right? I mean, it was crazy.
Well, the crazy thing is it looked like Oakland in the 80s. And that's
where there was just nobody like anywhere out and about.
Well, I mean, not that, but it was pretty like, you think about that.
Oh, because it was boarded up. Oh, God, because nobody was open. Yeah.
Like that uptown neighborhood, quote unquote, right? Yeah. Like, in the late 80s, that was pretty it was barren enough that you were scared. You know, it was like, you know, someone was going to approach you with a gun.
It looked like Mad Max or something.
Right. You know, and now it's like there's the, you know, the Fox Theater and the Uptown. And it's like where if I want to go see bands, that's usually the area I'm going to. Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's kind of a little bit of that Austin thing. There's enough people on the street now that, you know, and to drive through it and have it be like that 80s kind of style of like bleakness was really like it was like, oh shit, is that what we're
heading for? Yeah.
What we're looking at again, you know? And
yeah.
So anyway, quick rewind. That's, you know, when I think about those early records and our love of kind of the dark story, you know, and it was like, sure, you know, Albini was writing stuff like that, and clearly Rollins was, but you know, everybody was. Harry Cruz, Bukowski, you know, it's like very dark.
Hubert Selby Jr. I mean, there's plenty of, yeah.
You know, it was a dark time, kind of, right? Like, but we reveled in it, and so I don't know. Do you have the new remastered copy of Tulip?
I do. Yeah, it's lovely. I picked it up the second I knew it existed, basically, and I really enjoyed the liner notes to kind of help give the context for the times and things like that. Because especially as a band that was as mysterious as Steelpolebathtub was, which is part of the allure, there is very little information to be found unless you were like someone that was there. And I was a little too young. Like I wasn't allowed in a lot of these places, nor should I have been. So,
right.
so to be able to learn about it in the liner notes was great.
Those dark dens of iniquity, right?
Yeah. So it was nice to be able to glom onto whatever context was provided there. That still, you know, there's an allure of mystery about the band. Still, it's not like it was all laid bare and forensically analyzed or anything. But
well, good.
I thought it was a lovely package.
The mystery is definitely part of the goal, I think, always, you know, just a little bit. But you know, if you read like the three different descriptions of that era, like if you read Dorothy and Dale's, they're pretty bleak, you know?
Yeah. And, it's not like, you know, the magical Harry Potter side of things. It's more the like, yeah, watch your ass side of things, which also matches from, you know, my experience first moving to Oakland was like, oh no, this is you have to watch out where you're going here, and you must treat the area with respect and be aware at all times because bad things can and will happen. And then of course now it's artisanal mac and cheese and.
Totally.
You know, everything's like totally brunched out. Where it's like, oh, okay, well, this is not what this used to look like. I don't know what to tell you. Which
it's pretty.
You know, I guess we're describing gentrification is what we're doing, but I mean, you know what I mean, where it's
sort of. I mean, but it's also a giant cultural shift. I mean, gentrification, like, you know, it's. I mean, I have a bunch of feelings about the whole thing in general, but you know, when you think about context and artisanal mac and cheese, it's a lot harder to get up and sing some song about like, you know, sex with, Siamese twins and then like child sacrifice in Florida, right? Like,
and by the way, try the veal. Yeah, it's a different vibe and a different mindset because there were, and as you all know, there's been a lot of talk of like old San Francisco of late on this show for whatever reason, and there was this idea that like there could be anything around the corner, like it could literally be anything.
Oh yeah, I memean, okay, so
good or bad
that we had the early, like when we made Butterfly Love, we had this apartment on Van Ness at like 21st. You remember the old Cala?
Yeah.
Cala Foods. We were like half a block away from that, in towards town, you know, and that, you know, we would take the 21st Street BART or 24th Street, and you just never knew. Like, luckily, the thing about being a punk in that era, or that's whatever you would call whatever we were doing, you know, was that we had nothing. Like, maybe I had $2 or something that was my burrito for the day. But literally there was no reason to mug us or do.
You didn't have anything. Exactly. Why would you bother?
Yeah. And we were also dumb and tough enough to kind of, march around in those spaces. But, there's definitely lots of stories. Anyway, so I remember we had this apartment and I had the big room in the front with the bay windows and I was paying $200 a month, which is.
That's how much the window would cost these days. No, you just get the window. You have to sleep on the sill. You gotta
stand up. You can stand in the bay portion of the window, right?
Yeah, maybe get one of those restraints that you use for stretching out the back, and you can sleep that way.
Totally. But I saw so much violence go on out on that street from my window. I'd hear some space screaming, look out, and there'd be two guys just beating the shit out of somebody, and there was just a lot of gnarliness going on. And so, I don't know. I always tried to, akin to those other artists that I was talking about, trying to cast, for better or worse, trying to cast that ugliness in a positive light. You know what I mean? Maybe not
right.
Positive. Positive is the wrong word. But just try and put some mystery and beauty to it in a way that, that you just kind of. And like I say, it kind of comes from my exposure to weird shit in Montana too, where you're like, holy shit, this is so Lynchian what I went in retrospect, but before Eraserhead came out, or maybe right around that same time, but, kind of seeing some things you're like, this, he wasn't just making all that shit up. A lot of that was like things that if you went out into rural, poor Montana, you could see those things happen, or things very similar in vibe. And so
inclusive even of the Dennis Hopper style, like, what are we stepping into here? Like Blue Velvet, where you got Dean Stockwell singing. You're like, what in the name of hell is going on right now?
And you're like, okay, so I'm in a town of the population like 400.
Yeah.
And this evil guy controls at least half the town.
Right.
And,
exactly.
And if things go south, my experience of this could become very, very evil.
Yeah.
And I could be at the wrong either way you look at it, whether you're on the wrong end of that stick or the right end of that stick, it's ugly. There's
all these untold tales of minor miseries and major ones that you wouldn't necessarily even be beholden to.
Right. And so then you fast forward and it's bleak, whatever. And, and so you kind of, now I'm older and I've had therapists and, worked through all that kind of shit. But, you got to do your best to try and make it so that you're like, oh, wait, these things that I was witness to or had done to me or whatever are not horrible. Maybe they're actually beautiful. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
finding the allegorical way of representing that and turning it into something cool, whereas maybe the experience itself is there's nothing cool about it, but using that in some way to make something,
to take ownership.
Yeah.
And, kind of. And if you look at were you a Raw Comics fan?
Oh yeah. Oh Jesus. Wow. That's something I haven't thought of in a while. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, see, that's a good, just you open one of those, and suddenly it's 1986. Right. And it's like, oh, this is what they were doing in New York. Right. Because you think about New York in the 80s, you had the Lower East Side. And if you went too far east, that neighborhood was not to be fucked around with either, And so anyway, it's sort of, I don't know, I like to dwell on these things a little bit just because it's the paradigm of the art. The art didn't come out of a vacuum, and you can't just put it next to artisanal mac and cheese and have it make sense.
Right. It has to have context, and that's something that I feel there was a noir-esque element a lot of times to what you guys did in that way that it almost feels like it preceded one of those kind of, is it a documentary or is it is this a reenactment? What actually happened? One of those events that happen, like Slender Man or something along those lines. I feel like Slender Man would be a steel pole bathtub rich source of material if you guys were around in the Slender Man era.
Right. No, I mean, that's exactly. And, you look at other, there's a whole lot of other bands doing things like that. And it was sort of really, at the end of the day, it was sort of, if you were able to bend it to the pop medium enough, right? Like, or somehow make it less harsh, then you could, kind of pilfer it off on the mainstream, I guess, and in fact, I mean, I'm super aware, like, because my work now, like, I'm making music that often is consumed by tens and tens of millions of people.
Right.
And so I have to be super, like, aware of how far I push in any direction.
Because it's not necessarily its job to be disruptive. I mean, maybe it is, but it's not all the time. Like, in fact, sometimes it's better just to have it be something that just is there, and it's not the focus.
Right. Yeah. You're just part of the band, like the bigger band. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like the artists are doing they're part of the band, and the animators and the writers, and everybody's part of this giant band. And
sometimes you're playing lead guitar, sometimes you're playing the triangle. It's okay,
That's right. And sometimes you're just sitting on your, holding your bow on your lap, right? Like,
waiting 16 measures until it's time to play.
That's right. Exactly. And that's just, but times are different. But interestingly, people are now, like, I think the noise / industrial thing, people are becoming very interested in especially those textures, like the distortion, and because we just went so digital for so long that it's all of a sudden it's like, how do you make that sound? And it's like, well, you turn on an amp and screw with the wiring so that your guitar is shorted.
Yeah. You're purposely trying to make like a wrong sound good and a good sound wrong, and that's in that kind of. God, it's hard not to repeat a theme when you're doing the show practically every day at this point, but I've talked a lot in recent episodes about this idea of like the drone thing and the experience of going to see the drone show, whether it's like Sleep or Sun, but having the experience of having this visceral volume where you physically feel it moving and everybody there for the same thing as a communal event. And the fact that that's something, unless you have like the Marty McFly speakers at the beginning of Back to the Future, you're not going to be able to have that experience. You're just not.
You are not. No. In fact, Dale turned me on to, I forget what it's called. There's some festival in Minneapolis that's like this 24-hour sleepover thing. Like, people bring pillows and there's just this music that goes nonstop for like 24 hours or something. And now of course they stream it, so I can sit comfortably in my home.
You can have your own cocktail in the comfort of your home. Yeah.
tune in for a little bit and then tune out and whatnot. But it's that sort of thing. In fact, I missed this show, but I wish I'd seen it. But I think my engineer, I don't know, Noah Landis, who was in Christ on Parade and Neurosis now. Yep. He's done all my engineering for 15 years now. Anything I record, basically, he's part of, because he can, like I'm pretty good with the production stuff, but it's like I like big picture. I like I'm a composer, right? Like I'm more about the structure and the composition of the thing, whether it's noise or sounds or an orchestral composition. But he's like the super ears and knows all the names of the microphones and all that shit. And
right, yeah.
and
he's the Scotty to your Kirk is what you're saying,
right? And and like Scotty, he puts up with my bullshit, which I am forever grateful for. And he's just the greatest guy, one of my favorite people in the world. But I think he went to the show that was Laurie Anderson at I want to say it's the Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, but it might be one of the other churches. And she had all of Lou Reed's guitars laid out, and like amped up, and like she was going around and strumming them in open tuning and getting them like resonating.
Right.
And apparently like just filled this church with the sound of Lou Reed's guitars for like 4 hours or something. Like people were just laying in the pews, like just taking it in. I was like, oh, that's fucking rad.
That sounds like as good an elegy as I can think of for Lou Reed. Jeez.
Exactly. You know, it's so cool. Anyway, yeah, drones. Yeah.
And Noah does also play with you. I don't want to get too much more off course, but within the which I believe last I heard it was still called First Church Radio Shack, right? Like Noah's
right.
You've done at least one show because I saw it.
We have done one show thanks to Conan Neutron.
They'd be browbeating you into doing it.
Yeah. Well, you know, to be totally so you know me now well enough now that I've finally figured out why I'm so slow to agree to do anything is because I have this weird thing of like I don't want to reply to people if I can't say the right thing. Like, and so I'm just always like, I don't know. It's terrible. It's a terrible trait, but I'm working on it.
Well, but I think that was interesting because it is coming from a more composed standpoint. I think it sort of splits the difference between, you know, it's hard to say flaming lips now because that means a bunch of different things, but like the more kind of composed orchestral stuff there, along with like the more weird cinematic heaviness of Neurosis and things along those lines. Like it kind of brought a little bit of both those things while still sounding very much, you know, sprung from the head of Zeus from yourself as well. Like it had its own thing, but it's weird because what I'm talking about isn't that it necessarily sounded like those things, but it utilized similar cultural shorthand for it. And I find that really interesting because it's not that there wasn't like a through line for it from other things that you've done, but it definitely had its own voice to it. It was really interesting. I really enjoyed it.
Cool. Well, I hope I do, you know, Noah and I
should maybe do another show at some point.
We
record something.
We plan to at least finish that record. Like there's a whole story, beginning, middle, and end. And, you know, there's not material for all of the story yet, but, you know, so I did read a review that said like a rock opera or something. Well, that's not really right, but, you know, fair enough. Like you know, a string of rock songs that tell a story. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's deeply conceptual. So, I mean, I think by nature of it, the flirtation with the words rock opera are just going to be, it's in the general orbit, whether you like it or not.
Right. Yeah. But that I think that'll happen. And yes, like it's hard not to at this point, like I finally have control of a lot of my music, you know, and so it'll be like if Steel Pole ever does something again, which is entirely possible. I mean, it comes up at least 3 or 4 times a year. And you know, usually it's the same text. You know, we have this ongoing text thread that is like, hey, have you checked out this? What are you listening to? Like, have you, like, I'm going through this thing with this psychological, you know, whatever. Like we're all really good friends still. And then there'll be like, hey, someone wants us to play this festival and such, and, you know, and then we're like, and inevitably it comes around to like, well, if we're going to do that, let's just go rent, you know, Tim Green's place for a month and hang out in the woods and make a record instead. Right.
Right.
And so,
right. So then you're like changing, you're expanding the scope to the point that the scope becomes focused on something else entirely.
And it's impossible anyway, at least currently. But, you know, it's one of those things, like if I were to do that again, I'd have to let all that go. Like I'd have to step back and be like, okay, I'm just a part of the band and, you know, I'm going to contribute the parts that I do. But we were always, all three of us, contributing on multiple levels at the same time anyway. So, you know, I would love to do it, honestly. Not to bring that topic up myself.
No. I mean, it's okay for you to break news like that. I don't mind. It's not going to offend me. Don't worry about that. No, that's wonderful. And you know, it's something where there's been enough of a new generation of fans of weird music that there's people that listen to those records still and love them that maybe they weren't even like born when you guys were around the first time. You know what I mean? Like flat out. Like, and it's, and there's an appetite for it. Is an appetite where like, hey, suddenly you're going to be a band and make your money on touring? No, probably not. But that said, there's enough of an appetite for it that, you know, if that were an avenue you were going to pursue, I think you'd find that there'd be not just a bunch of bearded, pot-bellied old-timers hanging out necessarily.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the beauty of the modern thing, right? Is like there's room for every niche, right? Like you can kind of do that. I mean, I definitely, there's, you know, like when you look at Neurosis or bands that can still go out and fill a theater and you know, because they've just continually built it up over time. I kind of wish we'd done that a little bit. But then when I look back, it's like we needed to not be touring anymore at a certain point, you know, like, you know, I think the last year we toured 8 months or something. And, you know, it takes its toll for sure.
Well, it seemed like it went to the point of it being from sustainable to not sustainable. And I think that's, you know, that's tough. There are bands that I've warned them. I'm like, look, I love that you're hitting it this hard, like Black Flag, but you're going to burn out. Like, you got to be careful, man. Like, just, I'd certainly, myself, I always am totally okay with trading, not being able to do everything all at once all the time with sustainability. And I think it's a hard thing. Usually you need some retrospection or, oh, we fucked that up. to realize that, but I think it's important.
I mean, huge respect to the bands who have managed to keep going too. You know, like the Melvins and Neurosis, and you know, on and on. Like they've built their lives in such a way to be able to do it and present it the way they want to present it, and you know, it's wonderful. Absolutely, huge. And there's no, you know, it's one of those funny things in life where you can choose to do this or that or the other thing, but you can't choose to do this and then claim that at the same time. You know what I mean? That's one of those weird things about getting older, is that you can claim the things you've done. Like, that's totally fine. It might not be very cool to claim things, but you definitely should not be choosing one and benefiting from it and then claiming the other. And so I have just enormous respect for bands, touring bands and working artists. Like, and I'm a working artist, but I mean like a performing artist, I should say. Right. You know? Yeah. So I do want to kind of, there's a couple things I want to get into, not the least of which is that I think we left it at Butterfly Love. So, oh, sorry. So Butterfly Love did its thing. There's the Marsha Brady artwork, which is a whole story. Still comes up. I saw an Instagram the other day where some, like, in the thread, you know, I got tagged, and then in the thread, like, someone tagged Maureen McCormick. And I was just like, oh, come on. She knows. Like, she's known for 30 years. Like, right. Can we just not remind her, you know, like. In case she's feeling litigious. I mean, not that there's anything there, but still, you know, like. No, for sure. But so that's Butterfly Love. You start, you know, Tom Flynn puts that out. Yep. That starts a relationship with Boner Records. And then at the same time, you're start working towards the stuff on Lurch. And wasn't Milk Cult kind of conceived of around the same time? I know the first thing you did was that Frank Groh soundtrack, the Love God. Right. Thing. But that was like a couple years later. Yeah, it was around that. I mean, Milk Cult was always sort of like, if you listen to just the samples in the Steel Pole records, like that was sort of Milk Cult at the same time. Right. You know what I mean? Yeah. Dale and I had both been doing, I mean, if you go back to that tape in Seattle, even the We Own Drills, there's cassettes playing during Kung Fu Love and whatnot. And we just hadn't quite melded the two together, you know what I mean? Right. In as far as we took it later with with Lurch, you know, like I think that there's quite a bit in Butterfly Love, but Lurch really starts to push it far forward, and so that stuff was always there. Milk Cult, I want to say it did start because of the Frank Groh film, which like I was working on, and then slowly but surely Dale became part of, and then towards the end Conco, and I think though, he only used a portion of that, or no, he used it for the pilot. So he made like a rough version of that film that was super fucked up. And the final film is super bizarre and like in outer space, and harsh and weird. But Stu from, the Australian band, not King Snake Roost, but the other one.
Let's see.
Oh my God, I can't believe I can't remember this. Anyway, he, in fact, he just has a new band in New York City. I forget what they're called, but it's like Noise Rock All Stars or something kind of along. I mean, that's essentially what it is. But I think it's also even kind of called something like that. But anyway, he ended up doing the music for the actual Sony film later on. But that kind of got us on this studio only weirdo, like we're going to go make these weird records that, that are purely constructs, never
meant to be played live, never meant to be necessarily like just sort of like a weird art thing in and of itself.
Yeah. Like purely just who knows if anybody will, if Tom puts it out, that's fine. Like, but then they ended up kind of being more interesting and consuming more of our time. And they we kind of came up with this formula that was sort of like do you know what exquisite corpse is?
Yeah, of course. Like the drawing game where you have the you start off with one thing and then someone else kind of comes up with something else, and the idea is you put it together, but nobody really has any idea what the other people are working on.
Done. Yeah, it's
right.
Like the drawing versions. Let's say you draw a head and then you draw the neck and then you fold the paper so the other person only sees the neck and then they draw from there.
Like enough to get started, but you don't have any understanding of what the other folks are doing.
Right, exactly. And you can do that with poems, and there's all manner of exquisite corpses out there. Because computers were just kind of becoming part of the studio process, which is another like pre-internet, like back where we had actually used, you had to calibrate the tape. And, So we were like, oh, the computer can allow us to do all these kind of constructionist things that now we all take for granted. It's like, of course you can construct music because there's whole genres that are purely that, right? Like,
right.
But back then it was like, oh, okay, what can we do with this new thing, right? And so one of the things we came up with is like, oh, if we get people in, we can constrain what we play for them, and then get them to improvise to the constrained version of this thing to kind of draw different style and types of performances out of them, and so we started doing that. And I think we ended up doing 3 or 4 records that way.
Yeah. So you had obviously, there was the soundtrack first, and then the next one is Burner Berry, which came up recently when I had Billy Gould on, and
oh, right. Yeah.
I sort of ambushed him with that one, and he was very surprised and pleased to hear about that. Because you have the Neurosis guys on there, like Blake from Jawbreaker's on there, Patton's on there, Carla from Ethel Mead, Geraldine Fibbers.
Right.
Mark Davies, I think, is on that too. Yeah.
Oh, Mark Davies is fantastic on there. Yeah. We were kind of just bringing everybody we knew that could, contribute in some way. And that was a little more like just kind of by the seat of the pants, like, okay, here, we're going to try this thing and let's get a bunch of guests in, and that'll be cool. But then it kind of started to formalize this idea, and we went to Japan and did it there, which turned into Vietnam June Pike.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wait, is that right? Vietnam June Pike, or was it, it's one of, it's like, it's one of those things where you string all the words together, like the names.
The like almost portmanteau, but it's not.
But Let's see if I can find here. Like I have the internet here, so I can.
you got the internet? Wow, you say, don't say.
Bruce Lee, Marvin Gaye, right?
Yeah.
So it's not Vietnam June Pike, because that's a really good one. But Bruce Lee, Marvin Gaye was kind of built off of all these noise artists that when we were on tour in Japan and then stayed an extra week or two, and kind of did one of these constructions with a whole bunch of Japanese artists, including the guy like from Violent Onsen Geisha and so on, a bunch of that sort of scene. And then we went to France and did Project M13, which actually a super organized, like paid for by the French government. We went and set up shop in Marseille,
right.
At La Friche, and brought in, it was like 3 to 5 sets of musicians all day long, every day, and it was super cool. It was really fun.
Yeah, crazy. Oh, by the way, Lubricated Goat? Was it Lubricated Goat?
Lubricated Goat, thank you.
That's better now than when I was just about to go to sleep, which is usually when I would think of that.
I know, that's, yeah.
Wake up, Lubricated Goat.
Shit. And then you're texting me, right? Like I thought of it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Project M13, obviously it's a fascinating record. It's really kind of the same but different vibe than the other Melt Cult things, but definitely like some bold sort of like no rules direction on there. Like there's all kinds of different songs on there, and I mean it was like a grant from the French government, right? That's
yeah. Totally, which is amazing. And the crazy thing is that while we were doing it, I mean, it was the best. Like, I have a giant apology to my ex-wife, Claire, who set the whole thing up, because she's from Marseille and is really tight with the people who sort of hosted the whole thing. And she didn't get thanked on the record. So if you're listening, Claire, I am still sorry about that.
Move.
So it just wasn't on purpose. It just somehow it just slipped, slipped our minds or whatever. But while we were there,
props on Protonic Reversal now, so it all works.
Yes, yeah, see, bigger and better than ever. But we were staying. So the La Friche is this huge art compound that they only have in Europe. I've never seen this sort of thing anywhere else. And it used to be the Gaulois tobacco factory, right? So it's this giant complex with big buildings and spaces where they would smoke or whatever, dry the tobacco leaves, and then there was the director's house, and we got to stay in the director's house that had this big studio in the basement. So we spent a month there, like I said, like kind of screwing around with musicians all day and then partying with them at night. And while we were there, the what we would call the federal government, but like the main government of France, had a giant election, and they voted in a new government, and they voted in a new cultural minister, and they all came and visited. So like we had this visit from like
wow,
the heads of French culture, and they were like, okay, there were Americans here and we want to see what they're doing, and it was super cool. That was a one of those dreamy experiences that was super duper fun. And playing and working with Dale and Conco was just always a blast anyway, because it's sort of like Steelpolebathtub, but with this other, Conco is, at the time it felt like way younger, but he's probably only like 5 or 6 years younger.
Right, which as time goes on, that matters less and less. But at the time, you're like, oh, you're just a kid.
But when he showed up in so if you look at those records, Butterfly Love was the one that we had practiced and played 1 billion times, right? Mm-hmm. And then we toured with Flaming Lips a bunch around that time, and they were always saying, like, you guys are so powerful live, like your next record needs to have that power. Like you should make a record that has, and their record, I think it was Taste Metallic or Clouds Taste Metallic or whatever, came out right around that time, and it, like, you could see they were trying to kind of do the Nirvana, like, it's live, it sounds kind of live.
Yeah.
The drums are a little distorted kind of thing. And so we then made Lurch, which they were like, well, okay, we didn't quite mean that, but you know.
Yeah, that's it. Sort of like you might want to leave something in there for the proletariat to be able to latch onto.
Right.
Pretty brutal record. I mean, I dig the hell out of it. Don't get me wrong, but it's like, oh, okay, there we go.
Well, and you know, to be fair, it was like Billy Anderson was kind of new on the scene, and he helped us kind of forge in that direction. And he's such a great producer. And you know, I'm always grateful when he calls that record out as being influential for him. But you know, it's pretty intense and brutal. And then so when we were going to make Tulip, we had sort of hooked up with Not Human, who he did air traffic or sound traffic control, which is this weirdo art electronic thing that was big in the in the 70s, and then San Francisco, and you know, good friends with a lot of, you know, this sort of extreme New York art scene, but older, like 10 years older than me, right? Like
okay.
that,
sure,
like a little different. And he was coming to our shows a bunch, and was like, hey, I've got this studio, the you know, sound traffic controls place, the compound, Rhythm and Noise compound. That's the other thing. It is Rhythm and Noise out in Hunters Point. And do you guys want to come use that studio and so we went out and checked it out, and there was all kinds of crazy contraptions and weird noise making shit and super industrial, you know.
Old San Francisco kind of vibe.
Cacophony Society, you know, good, like, because I'm dear friends with some of the SRL people, Survival Research Labs, which is another thing from that era. The robots, you know, the robot war performances
used to be next door to a Tiny Telephone for a long time. And
exactly,
what was it? They had that one, like the tree cannon where it like shot the trees.
Well, there's an air cannon, but oh my god, they had so many great things, like
all kinds of dangerous ass stuff, which is great because I mean, it's, you know, at the time you're like, that's awesome.
Yeah, giant tractors with spinning razor blades that would come at the audience. And
exactly, it's all like super Mad Max stuff. And at the time, like, wow, this is what life is like. It's like, oh no, this is going to change considerably.
Total miracle that no one got.
Yeah,
no audience member got hurt.
Nobody was maimed. Nobody died. It's a minor miracle.
Right. You know, Saint Teresa and, you know, Mark Pauline. Like, he should be sainted that he never somehow is a miracle. Like no one got hurt, right?
Exactly.
And so we were like, yeah, let's do this. This will be weird, and it'll be the exact opposite of what we just did. Mm-hmm. Like we're gonna go in and we're gonna construct this, you know, Beatles style. We're gonna go, you know, kind of construct this record. Which turned into Tulip, but then Not, who we thought was like this big producer, was like, well, I don't really do that. So I've got this kid who's 18 and just moved here from Arizona, but he's really good with the knobs, you know?
Yeah.
And we're like, okay. I guess. Okay. Like,
sure.
Right. And that was Conco. You know,
so that was Eric Holland. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and he was literally off the bus from fucking Arizona, and 18, and like, you know, liked to get up at 5:30 in the morning, and went to bed at 9 at night, and we were like, couldn't have been like, we went to bed at 5:30. I was going to say
you're like the opposite schedule of him at this point. Yeah.
Right, and so. But, you know, we became really close friends, but, you know, he came to San Francisco and started going to raves and was just super, because it was that era. Like, you know, raves were big and, you know, kind of like, you know, big scene. And so when we started doing Milk Cult, he really brought this other, you know, angle to that kind of constructionist thing. And, you know, the disco stuff and some of the things that I wouldn't have brought in as sort of the basis of a piece of music, but I certainly could put my guitar into a wah pedal and, you know, and play along. And so it kind of really, you know, when you deconstruct those records, it's kind of cool. The three different voices that are going on are so different, but different in a different way than a normal band. You know what I mean? Like they're just radically different.
So talk to just a little more. And I know that if somebody were to pick up the reissue of Tulip, which is, I believe there's still copies of that available. We could get a lot of this story, but talked about the recording of that record a little more.
So it was sort of like we were writing songs the way we normally would, and we put the drum set. I mean, here's the other thing is like, if you look at Butterfly Love, Tom gave us $500 to record that record. Right. And so we went into Razor's Edge with Jonathan, and, so we found a cheap new studio that hadn't, like, we were one of the first bands going in there, and I think the Melvins came in right after us, or maybe they had gone right before us. I can't remember. And then Tom gave us, I think, an extra $300 to mix or something. So we went in, we did overdubs. And so all that and mixed in like 2 days, right? Like, wow, that's kind of insane when you,
right. That's for such a bizarre and like just deep, weird record. Like there's a lot of levels to it. There's a lot of, and there's a lot going on. It's not, this isn't like a Ramones record.
No, right. No, it wasn't just
all love to the Ramones, but it's a
right. Like, okay, we're going to double that guitar, and then that kind of. I mean, we did do some of that, but it was way more. And Jonathan, to his credit, was also really like down with doing weird shit. Like he was like, yeah, let's just put that tape on here. Like, can we put the Marsha or Jan banging on the door? Can we put that? Or no, it wasn't Jan. Anyway, I forget who's trying to get out of the closet. But let's put it through a big delay or a reverb, and that. So anyway, that was like 2 days, and then Lurch was really similar because we were recording it more or less live, but we had more money, and Tom was a little more like, okay, I can tell you guys are going to do pretty well, so let's spend a little more on it. So we had maybe 3 or 4 days, but it was probably most of the time was spent mixing, and then we went into Tulip, and we had like 3 months with this warehouse studio space to just fuck around. Right. So, we would just go in there and we'd like track the drums but here's the thing is that instead of a big 2-inch 24-track machine, there was like this 1/2-inch 8-track machine. Right. And then a bunch of electronic gear. Right. And so it was sort of like, the 90s version of taking a double cassette player and playing onto one side.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Right. So we were just constantly mixing shit down as we went. And so that's why it kind of ended up sounding a little flat and thin. And why, when it came time to remaster it, like that's all we could do, is because I don't think I have any of the original, like if I have the original tracks, they are bounced down. Right. It's like going back to the Beatles or something, like, that's how they made those records. Right. And so those early records, it was all just ping ponging shit down to fewer tracks until you have one left. And then you go on to that one. And so it was cool. It was definitely way more experimental and constructionist, but we were still writing songs. It's just, okay, here we need an intro, how are we going to do the intro? It's like, well, I have this guitar part, but maybe if I took the guitar part and played the guitar backwards and then recorded it and played that backwards and then played along with it, that would make something cool,
Right. Just totally like crazy experimentation, just throwing things against the wall kind of deal.
And samples were kind of a bigger part, like they were, and we were listening to Paul's Boutique probably at the time, right? And so, and a lot of that era of rap hip hop was just so crazy great in the kind of integration of samples and whatnot. So
the Grand Theft Audio.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so it was really fun to put that together. I don't know. Like in retrospect, like I loved doing it. I'm not sure that Darren at the time was super psyched on the process. I don't remember, but it was fun because, we were very social. And so we could go down there and just hang out and play like, it was great. I remember one time doing a solo to something, and that's all we did that day. Is went and hung out, and we're like, well, what should go here? And I'd, how about this? How about that? And, and then do like 6 different takes and finally pick the last one. And then we like drank beer and,
right.
it was very, I don't know. I really enjoyed the process of it, which I think was also led to Milk Cult style, just hanging out in the studio and making shit, which in a lot of ways is sort of what has led me to where I am today.
Where you are now, yeah. There's through lines for all of it. So with Tulip, there's of course that reissue that came out a couple of years ago that was for Tulip for under Sinister Torch, I think.
That's right. Yeah, JJ. Yep.
There was a different artwork for it. It has the liner notes, everything. Were you guys happy with that record when it came out? Do you feel like that was a good representation for the band? I mean, it certainly, was my gateway into it for sure.
You mean the original Tulip?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it did, in that era, like we were always top 5 college radio, blah, 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 whatever. But that one really, like, it really kind of lit a fire for us in terms of being able to play colleges and more, we were it basically, going from Butterfly Love, which there were, like Gerard Cosley was super in, it was like us and Pavement, which is the weirdest thing in retrospect. Like,
right. Yeah.
He was like, these are the 2 bands, know? And then we did Lurch, and admittedly there were a lot of people who loved that direction we went, but it also made a lot of people go, what? Like, whoa, this is not like, you guys had some nice pop elements in that first thing. And where did that go? Right. And so I think Tulip kind of brought it back to a little more colorful sort of vibe, and, not exactly light fare, I don't think, but definitely interesting. And so I think it seemed, other than I think the recording quality, and that's why the remaster was such a good idea.
Bob Weston put his skills on it. It definitely sounds, if you A/B it, sounds absolutely like night and day.
Yeah, and it's every now and again, and to be fair, Noah Landis also had a hand in that a little bit, but he's worked with Bob a ton, and so they kind of work together a little bit. But Bob's just a wizard, and so. Every now and again, I was like, God, I just wish I had the original tracks. Like,
Right. Yeah.
So I think there was definitely a little bit of a, like, if we could have done that same process, but had it been on a digital audio workstation, then it would have been killer. Right. In our view, I don't mean like in the grand view of things that Tulip is a masterwork or anything, but, I think we would have been happier with the outcome if we'd been able to have both our cake and eat it too.
Sure, which makes sense. So talk to me then about Miracle of Sound and Motion. It's a couple of years later.
Yeah, and so then we're still working with Conco, and he was like going on tour with us doing live sound, which is funny. He was, he did that mostly to both to get to really know our band, because he was going to produce the next record, and he also wanted that experience of live production, but man, he hated touring. He just really,
wasn't for him.
Sleeping on people's couches and sweating in the van, just not his thing. But we're really tight friends, and we did have some amazingly good times together doing that. But and in the process, he became part of a bigger, better studio in the city called Poolside, and he and I worked at this place in Silicon Valley for a while on the Euphonics console, which is a really high-end mixing console that kind of came out or originated around that time. And so we got tapped into computers and high-end studios and high-end mixing consoles, and so we kind of went into Poolside with the idea that we would try and take the best aspects of what we did with Tulip, but then try and get the power of live and good recording, and just make a quote unquote big boy record.
Sure.
And I feel like we kind of did. We were a much better band by then, and and so it kind of makes sense that it
starts off with a bang. I mean, you got pseudoephedrins, like just out of the gate, you're like, oh, they're mean business. I'm just like how Soul Cannon was in the first record, where it's like, okay, it starts off ripping. Okay, cool, right on. And that's a moody record, but there's definitely, some of your more well-known songs come off of that record. And, it certainly is something where it seems like a good foot forward as far as, coming from the outside, for sure.
Oh, great. Well, thanks. I mean, I feel like, it's so hard. It's been so long ago, but, just as a band too, we were always, crazy players. We loved the live improv, and the way that we would, the way that Darren played was so off that you really had no choice but to just let yourself go into it and just trust that we're all going to come back together. And we would, it was this amazing,
very unique. There's no other band that quite did that kind of thing, as far as from my perspective. And it kind of took me a long time to sort of figure out certain aspects of it. Where it's like, oh, okay, I understand why that's happening now. But at the time, it's just like, wow, that's kind of went somewhere else for a while, and then it sort of came back.
Right, in a very freeform, we were all very into, John Coltrane, but in a very different way than, say, Helmet was. Helmet was into John Coltrane too, quote unquote.
Right.
But we were into the freeform thing. But I think by then we sort of started to realize okay, but we can also craft pieces too.
Yeah.
And that freeform thing has its place on a record that isn't necessarily, the madness of Lurch or the quirky Saturday morning cartoonness of Tulip, something just a little bigger and stronger and more purposeful. I wish I wish I could say that's actually what we were thinking, but it's, I think it's way more just my kind of projecting backwards a little bit.
Sure. Well, you're allowed. So tell me just about real quick the inclusion of the Pose cover. How did that come to pass?
Fuck, I honestly don't know. It was probably Darren's doing. We were big fans, obviously, and we partied a lot. We spent a lot of time in bars and clubs and seeing bands. Oh my God. And there was, a local sort of Irish drinking band that played all the time that we're big fans of. And so I think at some point, I'm pretty sure it was Darren was like, let's cover this. We were big. If you go look at our collection of covers, we did tons and tons of covers.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You had the Velvet Underground cover, you had the Black Sabbath cover, the Cheap Trick cover. All kinds of
Jimi Hendrix, yeah. And then there was the ones we only did live, which there were quite a few of, Devo included. And I think, it was sort of we need a song. And then we also had a friend who sang, and we were like, let's bring her in and get her to sing on it. And I think it was just one of those, again, non-precious moments where we were like, yeah, I think that'll fit. I don't think we were, again, in some ways I wish we were clever enough to be like, well, we studied the Beatles and the way their records are laid out, and then we studied Led Zeppelin.
Right.
And we just were not that. We were, and even if I had done that, one of the three of us would have been like, that's bullshit. Fuck you. We're going to do something else.
Right. It's how it shook out. Sure.
It had to be way more collaborative and the three of us agreeing that this particular thing is a good idea, and so I think that's probably how that happened. But honestly, you could ask Dale, and he'll probably remember exactly how it really did happen.
You mentioned covers real quick. There's two things I want to kind of bounce off of that. There's the I Dreamed a Dream cover.
Oh yeah,
that's backed with the Melvins cover of A Sweet Young Thing Ain't Sweet No More. That's what it is,
one
right?
of my. Yeah, it is. I Dream.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite covers I think we've done, to be totally honest.
Well, and it's interesting because both bands weren't necessarily coming from that different of a place, but they both have very different. It's a different type of, pulls a different feeling out of the song.
Right. Yeah, and it's a funny. It was the way and again, I could be misremembering. Dale will be able to tell you the actual answer to this. The other Dale, not my Dale, but
Frover.
You know, Buzzesdale. Yeah.
Too many Dales.
Too many Dales. But we were playing in, you know, there was a pizza place in Champaign, Illinois. Fuck, I can't remember what it's called. But it was the weirdest thing. We would play there every tour, and like 10 people would come. Mm-hmm. But every time, those 10 people would be like Tad and the Melvins and Nirvana are there, or the Cows and, you know, Poster Children. And, you know, it was just every time we played, no one would be there except for all these amazing touring bands who happened to be nearby. Right. And so I have all these great stories of, you know, oh yeah, this one time when we were hanging out with so-and-so. Anyway, but so it was one of those shows, and I think we were on tour with maybe the Flaming Lips and Nirvana. And so that night Flaming Lips had a night off. So it was us and Nirvana. I think this is how this goes, but I could have it. I could be off. Or it was maybe Nirvana and the Melvins were touring, and then we happened to be there. It was one of those patterns, but we were touring with with Nirvana and Flaming Lips at the time. And so maybe anyway, so somehow Nirvana and the Melvins are there, and we're at the van after the show. You know how you're all standing around the van afterwards, and somehow the idea of that single came up. And that single was originally, you know, because it's a take on Mudhoney split with Sonic Youth, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
And I think it was Buzz, of course, came up with it, or one of the Melvins. And as I recall, it was originally supposed to be them and Nirvana, right? And they were discussing it. And I kind of, what I want to say, and God forbid I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure what it was is Nirvana eventually were like, you know, we really like Sub Pop and we don't want to piss them off, basically. Or
right.
Like it would be
sense.
Uncool of us to do this, you know? And so I think we were like, well, fuck, we'll do it.
Yeah.
You know, we got nothing to lose on that front. And so that's how the specifics could be wrong, but I'm 90% sure it was originally meant to be the Melvins and Nirvana, and it ended up then we kind of were the what's that called in plays? Like we were the study,
the understudy,
the understudy. That's it. Yeah, we like stepped in at the last minute, and so still though, great. I love the artwork on the cover. Like it's just one of my favorites. But weird story too about that one. Weird industry thing is, for some reason, that was right around when, you know, Nirvana was probably hitting, and we were touring Europe a lot. And so our record label in London was like, okay, this single's coming out. It's going to be huge. We want to, it was this thing that they wanted to do this thing where they print 2,000 and then they sell them to stores, and then they go in and buy them to drive them up the charts, right?
Oh, wow. Okay. It's like what they do with like right-wing books to get them on the bestsellers.
I'm 100% serious, right? And of course, at the time, you know, we were like, well, A, that's super unethical and lame, and we're not sellouts, blah, blah, blah. You know, like the sellout thing is kind of a joke now. But, and B, it was like, but have you heard the song? Like,
right, exactly. It's not exactly the song you would think would be rocketing up the charts.
Like you could put that to the top of the charts and still not sell any, you know? Like,
yeah.
So I just always thought that was so funny and so indicative of sort of the blindness of the big industry, you know?
Well, and I'd love to talk to you more, Mike. I just looked at the time though, and I realized we got to kind of wrap this up. I can't believe
we're going on like 2 hours.
Yeah. We didn't even get to Enlistable. We didn't get to Scars from Falling Down, but you know, I really appreciate all that. You just got to come back. That's the
next time.
Come back another time. So, last thing, it's the only canned question I ever do. I always ask folks is a pretty easy one, if you choose it to be, and it's why do you do what you do?
I'd say two things really. The people, there's two universes that I feel really at home in, and underground art is one of them. Like underground touring bands, particularly from that era, are some of my best friends and some of the most comfortable I've ever been in my skin. I don't necessarily consider. I'm very social on the surface, but that world has always made me feel at home. And then the kind of the work. Like, I like the work, and I like to work. In fact, I just shipped a game like 2 weeks ago, and I was working 100-hour weeks for 3 months, and I just I love it. And so, but the nice thing is on the flip side, when you're not doing that part of the work, your work is listening to records and reading comic books and all the shit that I love to do anyway. So, it's just good all the way around. And honestly, like, I think it's kind of the most noble thing humans do, other than maybe the thing that most people think of as noble, which is fixing the shit that humans fuck up for each other, and which is ostensibly more noble, but you got to look at the source of where that nobility comes from. Whereas I think making stuff and trying to create more and make more, beauty in the world that doesn't already exist is a good pursuit.
Yeah, man. Well, I appreciate all the beauty that you brought into the world, and thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Thanks for doing this, Conan. I appreciate being able to listen to the show, and definitely being on it. It's an honor.
And until next time, how about that?
Right on. I'll be happy. I can just talk forever. So.
Well, me too. So it's a dangerous combination. All right, brother. Take care. Stay safe.
All right. Thanks. You too.
There we go. Mike Morasky.
I was like, I'm not going to make this go 2 hours.
Yeah, man. It's a... Yeah.
Is this thing on? Can you hear me now? Are we going? Is this thing on? Test. Can you hear me now? As we come to the close of our broadcast day, this is my farewell transmission. Signing off, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all the ships at sea. Anyone within the sound of my voice. I've got 50,000 watts of power. I want to ionize the air. This microphone turns sound into electricity. Can you hear me now? Out on Route 128, dark and lonely. I got my radio on. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? welcome to my top 10. I'd like to thank our sponsor. But we haven't got a sponsor. Not if you were the last man on Earth. She was prepared to prove it. This one goes out to a special girl. But there is no special girl. It's the end of radio. The last announcer plays the last record. The last what? Leaves the transmitter. Circles the globe in search of a listener. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Really broadcasting if there's no one there to receive? It's the end of radio. As we come to the close of our broadcast day, my radio. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? This is a test! If this had been a real emergency,